Agnostic Agile was created to balance the trends that we have been seeing in the Agile industry of peddling expensive frameworks, certifications, and pushing a one-size-fits-all approach. We believe this goes against the original spirit and intentions of the Agile Manifesto. So we've created 13 principles that serve as a reminder to what it means to be in service of agility and to put our clients' best interests and context ahead of any framework preferences that we might have. And we do this by coming together as a community to learn, share, and grow together. And we hope to accomplish these three things this evening. So that's a little bit of what Agnostic Agile is about. It's great to see some familiar faces and some new ones. We have an awesome speaker here with us this evening. I've been following his work for quite some time. He is also a fellow meetup organizer, and he has been for a while. I think that's how I first came across his work. Thanks for contributing to the meetup industry. His name is Cliff Hazel. You probably know who he is already. I'll let him introduce himself, but he is going to be giving us a talk on Beyond Copy-Paste Agile. I'm really looking forward to learning about it. I'm sure it will be super insightful. Before I hand over to him, just a couple ground rules. Please try to remain muted at all times to minimize disturbance. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. And there's a chat system, so feel free to use the chat system and log your questions there so you don't forget. Otherwise, yeah, sit back and enjoy the show. Cliff, over to you.
Thanks, Nabil. It's lovely to be here. Just checking everyone can hear me. I have an unusual setup today because you are hearing me via my phone and you're seeing me via my laptop because, as I was explaining earlier, I'm in a hotel lobby in Brussels, which was not supposed to be the plan for today. Anyway, enough about my flight shenanigans. Cool. So I want to talk to you today about this topic of Beyond Copy-Paste Agile. Just to kick things off, I would like to ask a quick question. Who knows where this is? Type in the chat or mute yourself. Unmute yourself, I guess. Oops.
I have no idea.
No ideas. There is one person, Kasparos. You are correct. It is in fact Cape Town, South Africa. So the reason I'm showing you this slide is this is where my journey starts. I was somewhat frustrated, not too far from that big circular building, about the state of product and project management. And so I decided to do a few things about it and learn about some agile things over the course of my journey. One of the things that I did was go on a wonderful course, which ended up introducing me to a couple of people in another part of the world. And I ended up moving out here. Does anybody know where this is? A couple of people are correct. I guess Christina, you were in Stockholm, I think. Yeah. So yeah, you're correct. This is Stockholm, Sweden. And the thing that took me out here was the opportunity to work at Spotify. I joined the company when we were about 700 people, and I left about 4.5 years later when the company was around 5,000 people. It was a pretty wild ride, and some of the stories I'm going to tell you are based on my experiences, both as a coach and talking to other people who were using things. Maybe some of you have heard of the famous or so-called model that is named after the company. This talk is based partly in response to that. And so let's jump in. So the story goes, a kid is watching their parents cooking a roast dinner. And for those of you who have kids, you of course know that a child's favorite question to ask is why? Why do you do this? Why do you do that? Why do you do the next thing, right? The kid notices that the parents at some point, just before they put the pan into the oven, what they do is they cut a little piece off the end and put the pan into the oven and start cooking it. The kid, of course, goes, well, why? Why do you do this? Parents look at each other and they go, well, actually, we have no idea. We learned this from our parents. So a hop, skip, and a jump through the parents, the grandparents, they end up with the great-grandparents, still trying to find the answer to the great mystery of why this piece is being cut off the top of the roast before it goes in the oven. The great-grandparents pack out laughing as soon as they hear this question, and they say, well, my dears, The reason for this was that when we got married, we did not have so much money. We didn't have a very big house, didn't have a very big kitchen, and definitely not a very big oven. And so our pan was very small, and the only way to fit the meat into the pan was actually to cut a piece off the top. Now, I tell you the story because I think very often what I see companies doing is something very similar to this. We copy and paste and borrow and take ideas from other organizations all over the place, and we copy them into our organizations without necessarily thinking about the state of our oven or our pans. So I think what I want to introduce you to is this idea of what is our perception of our reality? Because I think this is part of it. If we start with a good understanding of where we are actually at, then we are able to build something that actually can kick off from where we really are. So if our perception, as those of you who've ever gone through a recruitment process at a company will have found, when the recruiter and perhaps some of the sales folks, and maybe even people who've been at the company for a little bit, they describe the company probably a little bit like what you see in this picture. It's all very shiny, it's very modern, it's very new, everything is very clean. But after you join, you may find out that the company looks a little bit different from the inside. Maybe it looks a little bit like this in reality, right? Now, that's not to say that this form of oven is necessarily a bad thing, but there is definitely some differences between these two. Now, I don't know about you, but perhaps after a couple of months of being at the company, you may have had the blinkers taken off and you've not yet drunk enough of the Kool-Aid, and you realize that the reality is perhaps a little bit more like this. And perhaps every once in a while, maybe around the time you do a deploy or some kind of crazy end of year event, it looks a little bit more like this, yeah? So you might be wondering, as I said earlier, why is this perception important? Well, the main issue for me is really that you can cook in any of these three devices, right? Each of these types of ways of cooking are really quite effective, but they're very good at certain things and they're not so good at others. I don't know if you've ever tried to cook a pizza in a microwave oven. Great for warming it up, perhaps not so good for cooking it the first time. The point here basically is that what you can do with each of these is different. They have different capabilities, different possibilities, and different things that make them most effective. So I want to encourage you to keep this in mind as we talk through these concepts and these ideas, because the point that I'm trying to make here is to really think about the context in which you are working and try to understand it a little bit better. So I started off by posing this question: how do we go beyond copy-paste agile? And I want to explore it today through three lenses. The three lenses are systems, science, and sapiens. And to unpack them in a little bit more detail, systems is about looking beyond the team level to create focus across all of the flight levels of the organization. Science, this is about how do we find the high leverage opportunities so we don't spend our time just being busy all the time. And finally, we will talk about sapiens, which is how do we build habits of consistency to help us design around the biases and default patterns that we have within our organization. I'd like to give you the three takeaways up front and see if you can find them throughout the talk. The three takeaways, and I'm going to elaborate on this and make a strong case for them, hopefully, is to do these three steps specifically in order: creating focus, finding leverage, and building habits. And I'll expand a little bit on why I think they actually go in that order as well. So if you're ready, we can jump into number one and talk about systems. So the question for me with systems is this question of where do we want to create focus? Where and what to create focus on? Now, I think all of us have felt something a little bit like this. We've been in the situation of maybe a coach, a leader, a project manager being pulled from one team to the other. Always super busy, 1,000 things on the go. There's never enough time to be able to do everything. And you've all probably seen a picture a little bit like this. The reason I show you this picture is because I think very often what we're actually doing inside our organizations as individuals, as managers and leaders, is essentially looking at a picture like this and saying, hey, if we want to be more efficient, we actually have some spaces over here between each of these cars. And so what we should do is we should put some more work in. And also, not only just some project work, I also have this really great change initiative. And of course, perhaps even a restructure, a couple of performance appraisals, and a year-end budgeting cycle, just to throw it into the mix. Now, I don't know if you've ever experienced this in the organization, but usually there's a lot of change programs and things on the go. and it's not so common that we actually have a very stable organization. So I want to give you a little bit of a metaphor for understanding how we think about problems in this space. So I want to encourage you to think of your organization essentially as a keyboard. Now, if your customer comes to you and says, hey, we would like you to write us a love letter, usually what we've done in the organization is we've organized our teams as if they each have one row on the keyboard. And of course, as the company has grown, we've specialized the teams even further. And what we've done is we've made each team responsible for essentially one team on the keyboard. The challenge with this is that if we want to be able to write an effective letter from the customer perspective, what we need to be able to do is actually push the right key at the right time. You saw in this picture of high utilization with the traffic jam, what we're normally doing is we're focusing on trying to push the key as fast as possible. And so we've got the team that pushes the A key, pushing that key as fast as possible. But at the end of the day, from the customer's perspective, we're not actually getting a better letter. So the first thing that we need to do is start to shift the focus around in the organization and shift it from focusing only on the performance of individual teams and start to look at the interactions between the teams and how do we coordinate and communicate between them. I'd like to suggest that every organization essentially needs a healthy dose of these. We need them for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We need them at every level in the organization. And I think very often what we do is we're not actually focusing on creating these in as healthy a way as we could. So I have a little mental model that I use for thinking about this in an organizational design. And the concept is essentially, it's called flight levels. And the idea basically is that if you think about an organization as split into 3 levels of abstraction, so 3 levels of detail. The metaphor is basically if you fly close to the ground, what you will see is quite a lot of detail. You can see the trees, you can see the sand, you can see the people walking around. However, if you're flying low to the ground, you don't really see so much into the distance. You cannot see very wide. However, if you fly really high and you go maybe supersonic, what you gain is you can see this enormous breadth. You can see far into the distance, perhaps even the curvature of the earth. But what you lose is you lose the detail. So what I think is important is that what we want to try to do is actually connect these different perspectives together, because each of them is quite unique and quite important in creating an effective organization. It's not about one or the other. It's not about one being better than the other. We actually want to create this interaction between all of the teams across all of the levels. So there's a great quote that I like from Don Reinhardt that he uses in this. And I think very often what we see in organizations is we're not trying to build this cohesive unit that you see represented here in this picture. What we're trying to do instead, as I said earlier, is essentially optimizing the A team to press the A key. So we empower the teams, we give them autonomy, and we say, off you go. But the challenge is that essentially what we're doing is we're only giving them the authority to make these decisions, not the information that is necessary to make good ones. The wonderful quote from Don Reinhardt says, decentralizing decision-making and control requires both the authority to be able to make the decisions, as well as the information to be able to make a good decision. So what I want to do here is draw a fine point on this and say what I'm trying to get you to think about is going beyond the team level. We need to zoom out and start to focus on the interactions, the connections, and the collaboration points between the teams, not just within a single team. So if this is point 1, what I want to suggest is that very often when we get to this place, what people say is that, yeah, sure, like we can focus on that. But the problem is we still have space. Despite all of the evidence, that team over there doesn't have any work for next week. And so what we need to do is we need to give them a new piece of work and a new project to work on. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story about how we address this at Spotify. And I'm going to show you one of the Flight Level 2 visualizations for those of you who understand the terminology. But essentially, this is a portfolio system that visualizes across a team of about 120 odd folks. On the top right, you can see, well, actually, if you look at the whole system, what you start to see is essentially a Kanban system or a flight level system or something akin to a Scrum board. But the thing that is quite unique about this is if you look on the top right-hand side, you see 6 items labeled current bets. What these are is the top level priorities from the strategic level of the company that has said, cool, we are betting on these 6 things. And what we've done specifically is that we have sequenced them in order from 1 to 6. And what this means is that we have a situation where, let's say, for example, Nabil is working on number 1, the most important thing for the company, and I am working on, let's say, number 3. I go to Nabil and I say, hey, dude, can you help me out with this thing? He probably says to me, sorry, man, I'm busy working on the number 1 thing for the company. You might have to come back a bit later. Or you could offer some insights, say, hey, there's actually some documentation over here. You could check out how to do it. Or maybe chat to that team over there because they've worked with the system before, and you can keep moving that way. Better yet, I may already know, because we meet around this board every single day. I know that Nabil is working on number 1, and so I don't interrupt him in the first place, and Nabil gets to stay focused, much better mental or cognitive load, and can stay focused on doing the most important thing for the company. However, if we flip the roles, Nabil comes and asks me and says, hey, Cliff, can you come and help? I need some help on this thing. Reasonably, you should expect that within, probably not 6 weeks, but maybe not, in 5 seconds, somewhere within the next couple of hours to a day or so, I should then switch across and jump on the thing that you are working on. What we're essentially trying to do here is create a fast track for the number 1 thing. And as all of you know, if we have a whole host of number 1 priorities, the saying goes, if everything is number 1, nothing is number 1. So what we're trying to do is create a situation where we don't let number 3 block number 1. And this enables us to avoid creating these traffic jams. The other piece of this is that it's very important that we think about doing this actually at all 3 levels. And very often I get asked, well, which level would you start at? Quite simply for me, I think about it in this way. If you can work at the top strategic level of the company, and you can remove one of the strategic priorities, or better yet, sequence the strategic priorities, you would probably have far more effect if you can do it at the top level of the company than if you did it inside one team or squad or area of the business. So I like to try to use the higher level leverage, and we will talk a little bit more about leverage later on, but the higher level lever that we have by starting from the top and working our way down. Most organizations who have gone through an agile transformation or adopting agile methods, they've mostly applied things like whip limits and maybe some sort of systemic focusing mechanisms, really only at the team level. And then they do something totally random and uncontrolled at the top. So what I want to encourage you to do here is to think about the other levels. Try to move up at least 1 level if you can. If you can do level 2 across an entire department, you have this huge impact across the entire area with one tiny simple change. If you're interested to dig a little bit more into the story, I've actually written a couple of posts about this on my website, and I'd be happy to share them with you if you're interested. I should actually include the links here, which I think I will do for next time. But there's a whole bunch of interesting stories about how I worked with one company where we went from doing 400 projects concurrently down to 15. And as a result of that change, with exactly the same teams, the same people, the same technology, their lead time for projects went from an average 12 to 36 months, so typically 1 to 3 years, down to 6 to 12 weeks. So they were shipping something in half to 1 quarter instead of in a year to 3 years. I'm talking to a bunch of folks who have some knowledge about Agile, so I'm suspecting the concept of whip limits is not necessarily profound to all of you. But maybe the difference here is to think about applying them at other points within your organization, rather than just at the team level. If you want to see faster stories and tasks, that's where you make the limit. If you want to see faster projects and initiatives or bets, maybe that's where you need to see or apply your limits. So what I want to do is sum up this piece on talking about systems by saying there's 2 key points that I want you to take away from this. The first is to go beyond the team and focus on the interactions between the teams. And the second is to think about how do you avoid letting your number 3 block your number 1 so that you can avoid creating traffic jams at every level within the organization. If you're interested to read a little bit more about these topics, I have 3 book suggestions on each of the points for you. So on systems, 3 books that I can recommend. You may possibly have seen some of them. On the left, Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. This is essentially the 101 primer on systems thinking. I know actually in Sweden, a number of universities and schools use this as their textbook. Highly recommend this book. On the right, we have Escaping the Build Trap by Melissa Perry. A wonderful book if you're looking at how to create product development and product strategy deployment systems in organizations as they scale. And in the middle, we have Rethinking Agile, which is Klaus Leopold's book that talks primarily about the concept of flight levels in a bunch more detail. So this is the topic of systems. Let's jump into science. So for me, the topic of science is about trying to overcome this habit that we have, where we try to solve problems like we saw in the earlier picture by just working harder. The problem for me is that I've worked my life in a number of companies that have tried this, and I've yet to see this work. It might, for a very brief time, create some momentum and some energy, but certainly over the long term, it tends to more create burnout, stress, and a lot of people leaving the company. I want to put it to you that what you work on matters far more than how hard you work. And I want to explore a little bit about why that is. So if you think about a bicycle, right? A bicycle has this unique capability of being able to take human energy and deploy it in a way that creates momentum in a far more powerful way than walking or any other method. If you look at a simple graph that shows the efficiency in terms of the amount of energy consumed by distance covered, you can see that a bicycle is far and away more efficient than walking or a car by several orders of magnitude here. The challenge, however, is that in our organizations, when we think about the concept of leverage, we're not really focusing on where to try to find it. We tend to focus more on trying to get the work done. The problem with this is that it leads us to a situation where, in my experience, a lot of people are not able to answer this question. Very often when I arrive in an organization, I say to them, well, what was the result of the last thing that you delivered? And at the very best, the answers that I get were, well, the project was closed and we did a retrospective. Every now and again, you find an organization where they can point to some sort of, maybe an indicator or some sort of measurement. The big challenge is that we tend to focus much more on the output side of this equation than on the outcome side. And when we rarely know the outcomes, the problem is that we cannot use that information to make better decisions and to find the higher leverage activities in the future. So essentially what's happening here is we're so busy that we rarely make time to check the results of our delivery because we hand it off to some other team or just let it go out into the market. And we seldom look for and work on, as a result, the highest leverage items that we could be working on. I want to explore a little bit about why that happens. And I think part of the issue here is that very often our business cases and our plans for doing things look a little bit like this. I don't know how many of you know of the Underpants Gnomes from South Park. It's a wonderful story about these gnomes who have this plan to essentially take over the world. The problem is that their plan is to do step 1, and their goal is to achieve phase 3. They do not have an intermediary step. They do not have a step 2. And so what they end up doing is spending a lot of time collecting all the underpants and not getting so much profit. And I think we do this a lot inside our organizations. Another part of this problem is that we essentially behave in this kind of a manner. We look at random data points and construct some kind of a narrative that really doesn't make a lot of sense. Cartoons like this, I think I've seen so many projects and so many ideas illustrated, strategies for different companies that are basically this narrative. So why does this happen? Well, the first part of this is that, as Jonathan Haidt explores in his wonderful book, The Righteous Mind, he says the human mind is not a story process, is a story processor and not a logic processor. And what this means is that if you unpack it further, basically we like to think of ourselves as being rational beings. We come up with some data, we analyze it, we make a decision, and then we take action. However, that's not quite the full truth. What we actually do instead is we use our intuition most of the time to make a decision, and then we use our rational reasoning capability to construct a reasoning or justification for that action afterwards. So as Jonathan Haidt says, intuition comes first, strategic reasoning comes second. The other part of this is, as Annie Duke explores in her wonderful book, Thinking in Bets, we tend to do what we call resulting, or what she calls resulting, which is essentially assessing whether or not something was a good idea based on whether or not we won or not. So the short version that she tells in the book is essentially, if I win the hand at poker, I must be a good poker player, therefore I should keep playing poker. Reality, however, is that this tends to disregard the influence of luck, and it ignores the fact that there are many other factors that are on the go here. So what we have to do is, or at least my question to you is, well, what do we do about that? I think in order to overcome this habit of just having these kind of weird extrapolations and making assumptions based on the results of what happens, what we need to do is take a step before we start working. Quite simply, that is to write down our hypothesis. How often do we expect something to happen? Or what would happen as a result of it? We can then use this to reflect after we've done what we planned and see what the difference is in the result. What this means is essentially we could do something like this. If we simply write down, if we had this feature that we're planning to build, this project, this product, this person we want to hire, whatever it is, what would the benefit of it be right now? To be amazed how often just that exercise of writing it down makes us realize that we actually don't have a very good justification for it. And in many cases, it gives us an opportunity to make a better decision as a result. Another question that I like to ask in this is what assumptions would need to be true in order for this to work? So just like the underpants gnomes, we're going to collect all the underpants. That's step 2. What are the assumptions that we're making? Are we going to be able to sell them? Are we going to be able to turn them into some other byproduct? Are they going to be worth something in the future? What's the actual reason that we are collecting these things? So, what I want to encourage you to do, if you're trying to get better at finding your leverage, is to first start quantifying your hypothesis before you go and reflect as you go. So, the second piece of this is to look for your leverage. Once you've gotten good at writing down your hypotheses, you could put a bunch of them up on a wall or on a screen and take a little bit of a look at them. I don't know how many of you know of a guy by the name of Shreyas Doshi. He talks a lot about product management, and he has this wonderful framework that he calls LNO. Essentially, it's leverage, neutral, and overhead. The idea here basically is what he's trying to make a case for is that leverage items tend to have very, very large payoff, right? Huge bang for your buck. The problem is that what a lot of us are doing is we're spending time either in neutral things, one-to-one, making a sale that is generating some small amount of revenue, or something like overhead, managing the finances, filing our taxes, these kind of things. Essentially, what he proposes is that we categorize our items into these 3 buckets and then take these 3 different strategies that are described here. When it's overhead, what we want to do is just get it done. We want to actively try to do a bad job. Take an example of your tax return. You don't get bonus points for getting a perfect tax return. It's either done or it's not done. So you want to do it just good enough, but no better. You don't get any bonus points. Then, for the neutral tasks, you want to do a good job, but no better, right? There's no point in overperforming if it doesn't make a significant difference. However, on the leverage side, this is where you want to do a great job. And as he says, you could let your inner perfectionist shine if you so choose. And what we want to try to do here is spend as much of our time as possible working on the things that have high leverage and as little time as possible working on the neutral and overhead. Now, I want to caveat this and just say, I don't mean to the point of neglecting your business. If you don't file your taxes, you will get in trouble and you will go out of business. But try not to spend more time than is necessary on them, or perhaps consider outsourcing them so that you can spend your energy on the leverage. So I want to tell you a quick story from my time at Spotify of how we found something that I think was particularly high leverage as agile coaches within the organization. So what was happening was in the organization, and many of you who've been coaches or scrum masters, you will have seen this, essentially you turn into a retrospective machine. once a week or every other week, you get asked by teams to come and facilitate a retrospective, and you end up spending all of your time looking for different ways to facilitate and all of this kind of thing. When we thought about this and we said, well, this doesn't make any sense. Let's try instead to build a way to teach the capability to run retrospectives into the organization, because our hypothesis was essentially that the more improvement and reflection that can happen within the org, the faster it can learn as a whole. So what we did, we set up a Slack channel and we sent out a broadcast message to the whole company. We said, anyone who would like to learn how to run retrospectives, we're going to be holding some coaching sessions. We're going to teach you, firstly, a simple framework for running a good one. Then what we're going to do is we're going to pair you up with someone who can help you to run your first few. And then we will support you and coach you and guide you through that process until you're happy to fly solo. And then we're going to pair you up with other teams who would like to have a facilitator. So we had product managers, we had tech leads, we had designers, we had folks from HR, people from all over the organization who came and said, yeah, I want to do this. Spend a couple of weeks teaching them how to run a good retrospective, giving them opportunities to try and practice these skills, and then created a simple spreadsheet system. Basically, you could fill in on a Google form, say, I want a retrospective. It would look who's available and pair you up with someone, and then you would start a Slack conversation and pair up. There was one very cool unintended consequence. The obvious benefit was that the coaches were freed up and that the quantity of retrospectives in the organization increased, as well as, I think, the quality to some extent as well. But the unintended consequence was that what it started to do was create these lateral links and connections between teams. So what would happen is, say, Marcel, for example, maybe you do a retrospective for my team. Next month, I do one for you. Then Nabil does one, and then Paul does one, and everybody takes it in turns, and you all have a chance to share, and you get to know each other, build some social relationships, and learn a little bit about what each team is doing. So I want to encourage you to think about things like this and look for your examples in the organization where you have something that has enormous leverage. I want to tell you one more story because I think I actually have an extra minute or two of time because I've gone quite quickly through the first part. There's another story that I haven't told many times before, and I call it Project Lollipop. I don't have a slide for it. But essentially what happened was one of the people who ran the IT department at Spotify realized that a lot of people had spare equipment, maybe an old keyboard, an old monitor or something, sitting on their desk that just hadn't been returned for whatever reason. What most companies would do is they would send out a bunch of policy-driven emails and kind of say, well, there's a box over here, you have to return it by this date or something. What this guy did instead was he went down to the shop and he bought a big box of lollipops, sent a photo of it on Slack and said, anyone who brings me spare IT equipment can have one of these. He joked and said that this was probably one of the highest return on investment for any box of lollipops on the entire planet. And I'm pretty sure that he is correct. Probably a few million euros worth of equipment was returned over the course of a few months. You went out a few times and had to buy new boxes of lollipops and even spread the practice to other offices in other cities. Now, what I want to encourage you to do here is to think about in your organization, what would your lollipop be? What would the one simple thing be that you could do that would catalyze a large and significant change rather than going the long, laborious process, policy, rules and structure kind of route? Very often, you will find that finding these points of leverage will give you enormous power. So I made this point already where I said, what I want you to do is to find your leverage. And the reason for this is that because what you work on matters far more than how hard you work at it. So to sum up this part on science, we talked about a couple of different topics here. Quantifying our hypothesis so that we write it down, reflect and learn from the outcomes as we move through our development. And secondly, to look for leverage so that we don't just work hard, but we can actually be smart. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about this, there are 3 books that I can recommend for you. I talked about the 2 on the left and the right already, Thinking in Bets and The Writer's Mind. The one in the middle is a book called Polarity Management. And this book is fantastic. Talks about the examples of why, or well, the subtext of it basically says, how do we solve unsolvable problems? And he tells these wonderful examples that explain why it is that organizations tend to go from let's centralize everything to let's decentralize everything to let's centralize everything to let's decentralize. And he has some fantastic tricks for overcoming this pattern. So there we have it. That is systems and science. So let's jump into Sapiens. So this topic is about the wonderful diversity of human beings. I'm wondering how often you've heard this statement being made. Any of you heard this? Maybe a nod of your head or a thumbs up in the chat. Yeah. Maybe you've even heard the slightly more obnoxious version of it, something like this. People resist change and won't work on that unless we tell them. So the challenge for me is that this is making, I think, a fairly large assumption that the people inside the organization are either not very good, or if you'll excuse the metaphor, are essentially dead wood. I want to put it to you that if you have dead wood inside your company, there's only two ways that it got there. Either you hired dead wood, or you hired live wood and you killed it. In each of these situations, it's up to you to address both of these, and there are a lot of concrete things you can do about it. So I want to explore a little bit why this happens. I think the biggest reason is that a very large number of our ways of thinking about the world and the way we think about organizations and about how people work is built on this. Essentially, we think of them as machines. And even in subtle ways, we don't really realize that we're doing it, right? I think that a much better set of metaphors than machines, because machines are interchangeable, replaceable, simply fungible parts. A much better metaphor for this is to think of a forest or an ecosystem. We think about it like this. In the case of a forest, you don't put motivational posters on the wall and set quarterly targets and KPIs for the trees. You definitely don't shout at them if they don't grow enough. And yet, we still see people doing this all the time with human beings. What we do in this kind of environment is that we plant the right trees in the right season. We make sure that there's enough water, enough light, but not too much. Enough water, but not too much. We do a little bit of weeding, a little bit of pruning, maybe make sure that there is a balance in the ecosystem, the right types of birds, bugs, wild animals, this kind of a thing. Yeah? It's a far, far more complex environment, one that we can nudge and manage, but not one where we can just rip out one tree and replace another one and expect it to magically perform in the same way as the rest of the environment. So why am I talking about this? Well, I think very often what we do is we make a number of assumptions about the environment around us. And I want to illustrate it by asking you, what is going on here? Can anyone take a guess what you think is going on here? Some hugging, yeah? What would you guess is the context of this, perhaps? Celebration, yeah?
Yeah.
So I'll be honest, the first time I saw this picture, my assumption was that it was perhaps either a wedding or perhaps a graduation, some sort of celebration in that kind of a context. Yes, Derek knows the answer. This is the scientists of the ISRO, or the Indian Space Agency, celebrating the fact that they've just successfully launched a Mars lander. They launched it on their first go, and they did it for less money, a tenth of the money, not just less, a tenth of the money than anyone else has done it before or since. And in fact, they did it for less than the cost of Hollywood's making of the movie The Martian. It is an incredible, incredible achievement. And I think for most of us, we don't make the assumption that people who look like that are scientists. I'll be honest, I definitely didn't the first time I saw the picture. I have another example for you. Can you tell me what's going on here? Any guesses? The answers I usually get are things like it looks like a very boring meeting. A couple of other things generally in that vein. Yeah, Pence is ratifying Biden's presidency, political negotiation. So the guy in the middle over here who's sort of pointing his hands forward, that is Mike Pence, who at the time was the vice president of the United States. Putting aside your political allegiances and so on, you might be surprised to learn that this is actually Donald Trump's Council on Women's Rights. They are having a conversation about a topic that, quite frankly, they have really no influence. Well, not no influence. They have a lot of influence, unfortunately. But yeah, I just don't see any way that this group could possibly make a good decision on that topic. I want to put it to you that if your meetings are looking like this, it's quite likely that you have some work to do or some problems. The challenge for me is that when we do things like this, whether we either assume that the Indian women are not scientists, or we think that this group of men could make a good decision about women's rights, what that exclusion is doing is it's hiding vital perspectives and information. And we do this many times in our organizations in ways that we don't necessarily intend. We create these scenarios unintentionally or perhaps unaware of the scenarios that we have created. So if you feel like that kid on the right, when you are meeting a leader, for example, or having a conversation about some sort of improvement, maybe making suggestions can feel that way, the likelihood that you are going to speak up, speak freely, and speak truth to power, I think is quite limited. Perhaps during a restructure, how often do you get consulted or even any kind of input? Certainly in the performance review, you can certainly feel this way. I want to put it to you that the perspective of the people inside the organization matters. And I want to illustrate it with a simple picture. Depending on where you stand, you see something totally different, right? It's the same person, the same picture, the same context even, but we take totally different things from this, yeah? So I want to explore this topic in just a little bit more detail and say, well, why is it that we have this habit of ignoring certain perspectives, jumping to conclusions about Indian women, that they're not scientists, and thinking that it's somehow sensible that Mike Pence and co could make good decisions about women's rights? Well, the story goes that millions of years ago, our ancestors were roaming around on the plains, probably not too far actually from where I grew up in the southern tip of Africa. And while you were doing this, if you were hanging out in that area and you saw something yellow jump out from behind a bush and come cruising towards you, you might find that you're not necessarily going to be staying alive very long. If you sit there going, well, it's yellow, it's moving quite fast, it's quite hungry, it's moving in my direction, by that stage, you would already be lunch. So what happened was we evolved the ability, rather than to think through all of these steps in a lot of detail, we've started to do what is called a fast fit pattern match, rather than a best fit pattern match. What this means is that it looks sort of like it might be a lion, and we run away, so we become alive in the future, or we stay alive in the future, and we live to survive another day. The problem with this pattern is that it also leads us to make snap decisions and judgments about other people. And so what we need to do is start to intentionally acknowledge that we have these biases so that we can design around them. If you think about it this way, if diversity is being invited to the party, what we're talking about here is also including people in the decision-making process. And so if diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is also choosing the music. So quite simply, if you are all men, product managers, software developers, senior management, invite some people who are from a different background, a different level in the company, a different socioeconomic background. Maybe they went to a different school. Maybe they come from a different skill set. Maybe they speak a different language. Mix it up. This will help you to start to address the basics. One extra example that I can give you is if you want to take this further and start to create more of an inclusive space as well, not just addressing the representation issues. This is a pattern that I've used multiple times in a couple of different organizations. Quite simply, what we're doing here, this is an agenda for a check-in across a tribe or a group of people. In the Spotify context, we actually use this at multiple different levels within the organization. But essentially, it's just an opportunity to check in with your management or your next level up to kind of create that connection across the different flight levels, as we were talking about. So what we would do is we would cover the first three topics that I think are fairly obvious. What have we achieved or learned since we last met? Secondly, what do we plan to do by the time we next meet? And three, what is on our mind? The fourth and fifth topics, I specifically separate them out from the third one. Fourth is what are we stressed by? And fifth, which of that, or out of everything that we discussed and possibly other things we haven't discussed, what do we need help with? The reason I like to separate this is that I noticed what was often happening is as leaders, we tend to jump in and assume that if other people are stressed by something, they automatically want help with that thing. It was almost never the case that the thing that was stressing somebody out was the thing that they asked for help on. And if they did ask for help on it, they almost never asked for help in the way that the leader would automatically have assumed. Maybe I'm attending some meetings and I need you to run air cover. I don't need you to jump in and make the meeting go away. I don't necessarily need you to give me the answer to this question. I need you to help me keep that other person busy or work on trying to shift their mindset or their at least their perspective on this particular problem. If you notice this happening in your organization, I can highly recommend separating these two out. The habit of doing this really, really helps a lot just to kind of get the leaders and the individuals into the habit of suggesting for this and specifically separating out where you want help. The other example that I think can help in this case, if you want to create a space where more folks can participate, is to think carefully about how you use written versus verbal communication. A lot of organizations, in my experience, tend to skew very heavily in one direction or the other. And certainly the organizations I've worked in, it largely skews towards verbal. We do public announcements, we do presentations, we do meetings face-to-face, all of this kind of stuff. And the challenge with this is that it tends to bias against those who like to think a little bit more deeply or deliberate before they give an answer. If you'd like to create a space where folks can contribute in a more meaningful way to these things, a couple of tips that you could do. One is to offer some pre-reading, whether that's a set of slides or a written piece of text or an email, some kind of thing that says, here is what I'm going to share with you. This is what my thinking is. Second one, to then provide some time to think rather than just saying, are there any questions? No. Okay, cool. Then we're done here. Make sure you give people some time to think. And finally, is to follow up. Make sure that you make time to then go back after a day or two or some other point when folks have had a chance for it to circulate and say, well, what are your questions now? What do you think about this? If you'd like to dig into this topic of Sapiens a little bit more, I can offer you three fantastic recommendations of books. On the left-hand side, I hope that all of you at least know of Esther Derby. If you do not, at the very least, this is a great book to start getting to know her work. 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change. She has a couple of really awesome and profoundly powerful models inside this. I would highly, highly recommend this one. In the middle, we have Humble Inquiry by Edgar Schein. He writes a number of different books. The other one I would recommend is also called Helping, but it's basically teaching you how to ask better questions rather than simply just telling. And on the right-hand side, we have Multipliers. This book is with everything inside the book, but there's one particular piece of it that is my absolute favorite. There is an insert in the middle that gives you a table of different leadership skills and capabilities and gives you examples of if you use this one in the wrong situation, here is an example of how it can perhaps go wrong and how to recognize and counter that with positive alternative behaviors. So to summarize, we've talked about a lot of things inside this topic of Sapiens. What I want to try to get you to do here is to acknowledge that we all have bias so that we can start to notice who's missing from our meetings, conversations, and interactions. And then to use that information to intentionally design around the biases that we have and to create these more coherent understandings of everything. So to sum up this in its entirety, when you want to go beyond copy-paste Agile, as we started out talking about, I want to encourage you to look at it through, or I want to remind you that what we did was we looked at it through 3 different lenses. First, we looked at systems, then we looked at science, and we looked at Sapiens. In systems, we looked at how do we go beyond the team level to create focus across all the levels. In science, we said, well, how do we find the high leverage opportunities? And in Sapiens, we said, how do we build these habits of consistently designing around our bias? So to put a final point on it, we're trying to create focus, find our leverage, and build sustainable habits. Now, the common counter argument that I hear for this when I present these ideas to people is a lot of organizations say to me, well, no, coaching, teaching, investing in our people, all of this, it's really quite expensive. We don't have the time or money for this. Essentially, what this sounds like to me is that, well, what if we invest in our people and they leave? Well, what I'd like to put it to you is, well, what if you don't and they stay? With that, I would like to thank you for your time and invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very active over there. I post every week about these topics that we have been exploring today in more detail and looking at them from different perspectives. I will stick a link in the chat as well. But if you want to just Google me and find me, I'd love if you would reach out and say hi or just connect and come and chat and engage with me on the content. I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback and explore a little bit of how this stuff could perhaps be useful in your organizational context. Thank you so much for your time. It's been cool. I think we will have some time for questions, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Cliff. That was wonderful. Really insightful. I learned a lot.
Cool.
So Q&A, people. If you have a question, feel free to use the chat. Feel free to use the raise hand feature or just unmute and ask a question. While people think, I selfishly have one, if I may kick off. So I loved the way you framed the Sapiens systems and the other one.
Science.
Science, yeah. Which one of those, and I understand it's important to tackle it from all angles, and I can see why you wouldn't want to neglect one, for example. Which category do you find your clients struggle with the most? And what do you tend to do about
that? I think of it a little bit as like a different stages of the journey, but the one that I like to start with is the first one. So looking at the different systems to figure out where to create focus. My hypothesis is something along the lines of, and I'll explain a context where it's different, but in most organizations, there's just so many things on the go. Nobody actually knows what's important. And so the biggest opportunity is not to try to get better at picking which items we want to do, but to actually just give something a fast track so that it can get done. If we can consistently as an organization, so not just within one team, but as an org, everything from marketing, sales, finance, product development, all the way out from end to end. Once we can get that flowing, then we start to get the letters being delivered as we were talking about. So it's not just typing fast, it's actually typing the right letters in the right order at the right time. Once we get that going, then usually we can start to have a much more productive conversation, and it's actually meaningful to get better at picking better things. But if we don't do that, we're still just having this kind of screaming match about, oh, mine's more important than yours is more important, blah, blah, blah. And it's just painful. So usually I start with that one. If you're working in an organization where they're already focused, then I would go a little bit further down the line. And yeah, the leverage and habits one can be a little bit interchangeable at times, but usually there is something a little bit about, okay, now that we've got good at delivering stuff, let's get better at picking which ones we bigger.
Oh, awesome. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, doing it sequentially, I can see why you'd do it in that order. Thank you so much. I can see there's a couple hands up. Thomas, awesome. Would you like to unmute and ask a question?
Yes, hi everybody. Cliff, you mentioned earlier, I think it was on a focus going to leverage, that you need to quantify things. So I mean, you had your green priorities, right? I mean, of course you can say it's a backlog thing, and then it's prioritized by values, so we agree that it's there. But the value is often qualified, right? But then you said quantify, and I went like, oops, okay. What is your experience? Any guidance on how much should you quantify, how to quantify, and maybe when not to quantify, or when you have to quantify?
So the other part of the prioritization conversation that I often see happening is that people are debating really how to justify something when they've already actually decided that they're going to do it anyway. So can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, cool. My video died, but I realize you're on my phone. Cool. Yeah, so basically what happens is that we're having this long, elaborate discussion about like how to sort of pick a better thing, but we've already decided that we're going to do all of those things anyway. If we're in that space, then I think it's what I said to Nabil already, just creating the focus. That's the first thing. Your question was about how do we actually quantify specifically and like how much energy would we put into this? I think it depends a lot on what you're trying to do. So some of the things in an organization are going to be very obvious that they're actually the number one thing, in which case I wouldn't stress too much about doing it. So if it's going to significantly shift the sequencing, or it's going to make something either be done or not done, then I would invest energy in it. But if we know we're going to do this and we're going to do it all the way through until the end regardless, the depth of quantification, I would say, is maybe slightly less useful. That said, the simplest method that I like is the one where I talked about, like, what would the benefit be if we had this today? And to try to describe that first in plain, simple English, and secondly, to try to put some actual numbers to it. So if we build this thing for the customer call center, it will reduce queries by this much. Or if we launch this product in that market, it would make this many sales times this much per user, therefore this much money on a monthly, quarterly, yearly basis or something. And then we can look at that. And rather than trying to be super precise on it, we can discuss it again to the point where how much would it move it either up into the list of things we would do or down out of the list. But I see a lot of organizations arguing about, like, half a decimal point. It's like, well, it's still going to be number one, even if you're right. So it doesn't actually matter. So let's, again, focus the conversation where it would be super helpful. If you want to dig one of the concepts that I like, I don't know if you know of a concept called CD3, or cost of delay divided by duration. This is one method that I've used in a product management context. I'll find the link in a second and send it to you. But it's a guy by the name of Joshua Arnold. His website is called Black Swan Farming. And he writes some fantastic stuff about how to use CD3. There's the link. I'll send it to you now. I would say that this is definitely more advanced stuff. So once you've got quite far down the habit of, like, you're actually focused, you can consistently deliver, what something about the results are, then getting into this can be meaningful. So the case study for this is actually Maersk, the giant shipping company. And he worked there for a number of years and helped them to make significant improvements in what they were doing. So it makes sense when you're at a much larger scale and a much sort of further level of maturity, if that makes sense. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
I have one more, just to jump in again. But again, guys, feel free to use the raise hand feature if you have a question. So you talked a bit about Spotify, and there's probably, I don't want to labor it, and there's probably no end to the praises we could heap on the Spotify model and how beneficial it's been for Spotify. I was curious if there was anything about it you didn't like. So what about it do you wish you could have changed, or something about it that you would have maybe done differently?
So I think there's a couple of things about that model that don't make sense for a lot of organizations. The one disclaimer that I would give is that the model that was represented in the piece, in the paper that was published, it was a snapshot in time. That model was never static. It was always evolving, and different parts of the org would be doing different things at different times. So there's always experimentation and iteration. So it's a very, very much simplified, abstracted, like all the disclaimers. The thing that I think is most often overlooked inside that is the story about why do chapters exist as a concept. So for those who are not familiar, essentially it's a matrix function. You have a manager for your skill set, and you might have multiple managers for different specializations within a single team. The downside of this is that you can end up in a situation where, from a team perspective, it feels like I have 5 managers in the team because there's one for each specialization, plus the product manager, plus whatever else. the reason why we had this at the time when I joined was basically what was happening. That's board that I showed you from the company, that group, when I joined in February, we were 20 people. I worked with them until November, and then my role changed into a different context. We grew from 20 to 120 between February and November. Like, that's the rate of change. So if you imagine as an individual, I join a team today and I have a manager for that team. Within 6 weeks, there are 30 new people within the org. I've got a new manager every other Tuesday. So the person who's doing my performance review or guiding my career or giving me any kind of feedback is going to be a totally different person. I mean, I joked and I said there was actually a guy that I knew who started, and from the day he was hired to the day he started, he had 3 managers. So you'd get an email update from HR, by the way, your manager's changed because we restructured or this thing shifted. But I mean, the org is just so big. So in that context, having a stable relationship with a single manager when you move between many teams, great idea. In the context where you've got super stable team structures, maybe not so much of a good idea. So I think it's worth exploring these kind of things and thinking like, well, what was the problem that we're solving? Yeah, I would say that that's probably the main one, because I see a lot of people adopting this and adding huge complexity into their organization when they often don't need it.
Great point.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. It was lovely to get that bit of insight. Do you think the
Cool.
Spotify model has done more harm than it has good with organizations trying to just copy it?
I think it depends. It's done a lot of good for a lot of people's bank accounts. I'm not sure about the other organizations. I mean, I had a long conversation with Henrik about this once. And the general sense that we had was that for a lot of orgs, what they were doing before was very weird and very broken. And so even if they make a small change and it gets a little bit better, it's probably not perfect. But I mean, the first time I did something with Agile, it was horrendous by today's standards, but it was much better than what we were doing at the time. And so I think it's that thing of like, as long as you're moving towards a better space, cool. You know, would I pay McKinsey 15 million euros for it? Probably not. But, you know, each to their own.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Last call for a question. Otherwise, we will wrap up. Going once, going twice.
Can I add something? Sorry, I've got my initials there. I'm Alexi. Cliff, hopefully, I think we're probably from the same place. Hoping we win on Saturday. But just yeah, just on the Spotify comment, it's just we followed the model quite closely in about 2016, and I think after a bit of trial and error, unfortunately, it wasn't a real fit for us. But I just, maybe to other people that have thought about following it, I think to your point, what was published was a snapshot in time, and for you guys it evolved and changed. And I think people that have made the mistake of using that snapshot didn't realize that you guys were evolving it and changing it. So they kind of try and follow it, but you see you fall into a lot of traps with it. You know what I mean? There was a lot of good stuff that came out of it, but I don't think it was really publicized that it was evolving. And because of that, I guess if we had followed maybe the progression with the model, maybe it would have helped. But yeah, I think we just took it as gospel and yeah, tried to adapt it, but fell into a lot of traps, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think I see a lot of organizations doing that. What they do is they try to copy the current state rather than the mindset that created that current state. And if you look at it from the perspective of like, the goal of Spotify was not to invent a model, the goal was to build a good music service. And that was constantly being evolved and developed. And what that meant in some areas meant, yeah, like we have to do super structured, rigid things. And in other cases, we have to be like totally experimental and discover the future. And in each of those contexts, you would operate, I think, quite differently. And so I find it quite fascinating when people say, well, yeah, we want empowered autonomous teams. It's like, yeah, but you work in an extremely regulated, extremely high governance, very controlled industry. How much autonomy can you give teams within that context? Like, you know, so the idea that they're a mini CEO to me is just weird in that context. It doesn't mean you can't use autonomy and can't give people meaningful problems to solve and sensible boundaries and explore all of that. But I think very often you just see people like, oh, well, we'll just take Scrum or Kanban or 5 levels or Spotify model and just plop it into the organization, and then magic and ponies come out the other side. And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't happen that way, unfortunately. Like, you have to do the hard work of iterating and experimenting and developing stuff. And that doesn't mean you can't take any inspiration. I think there's cool ideas. You don't have to reinvent everything, but it gets sold as if it's an off-the-shelf model. And I don't think that there is such a thing, because the problem is that the reality is that you're dealing with human beings, and we all have different expectations from the past. So if you could wipe my brain and reinstall a new operating system, sure, maybe you can transform the organization like that. But that's not how human beings work. We take time, and we have to adjust, and we have incentives and goals, and we have habits and patterns and all of this. And I mean, I could talk about this for days, but there's a lot more to unpack there. And you really just have to acknowledge that and go on the journey. It's not about having the right answer. It's about asking the right questions. I think that's far.
Yeah, I think what we learned on the journey was, that when we came out of it, I guess, was that one shoe doesn't fit all. And I mean, this agile landscape is changing all the time. And I think maybe with our company, we've been on the journey for a long time. We're maybe in a privileged position where, we can pick and choose, I think, some of the stuff that's out there that we think may benefit us and try it. It's luckily we don't have any red tape that says you have to do this and you have to do it like this all the time. Hopefully none of us on this call have that. But, I think we've found ourselves in a position now where, it's not just Scrum, or it's not just this, or it's not just that. It's let's pick the best stuff that works for us, call it what you want, and if it works, then great. I'd like to know, you said you started at when it was 700 people and got it to whenever you left 5,000. What does that model look like now? Do they still follow it, or have they dumped it, or where does it sit now?
Yeah, so I mean, I've left the company 5 years ago. I have a few friends that are still there, obviously, but like, there's a lot of things that have changed. But the essence of it, I think, is roughly still in the same direction. A lot of the names have changed for different roles and stuff, but I mean, the labels are not really the important thing. The one thing that has come more commonly is sort of much more of a single tech lead EM kind of role, but that's, again, the team is stable. You don't get the benefit of chapters, and it's but in plenty of orgs or plenty of areas of the org, they do still use that model because they are growing faster and they're evolving quicker. And so once it stabilizes, you use a different tool set, maybe to that, which was designed much more for high growth. But a lot of the other things around having a product leads for each area, having everybody inside the team having quite a lot of autonomy over the things that they work on, that is still the case. There will also be situations where, well, now we need to IPO or we need to do this compliance thing. You have to find people who want to work on it. And sometimes you hire them and you say, this is what you're going to work on. And they say, cool, that's what I'm going to do. So they go and do that thing. But yeah, I think the flip side of having too much autonomy is that you have a huge challenge trying to align people towards a meaningful goal. And so you have to weigh that trade-off a little bit and say, like, where is not the line, but like, which areas do we want to have highly autonomous, adventurous exploration, and where do we want to maybe be a little bit more structured and disciplined and cohesive? And I think a lot of the time when people think about autonomy, they think about it as like the leader gives the autonomy to the rest of the team, and that's the only direction that it flows in. But it's actually, even if you think about I build a product platform, for example, the analytics tooling. There's a data system underneath it. There's front-end interfaces on the top, all kinds of processing and stuff that happens. Those things have to work cohesively together. So they might be autonomous individual teams, but if they don't work together, you don't get a meaningful platform out of it. And if you work in the tech space, some of you will have seen some of the work Spotify's released, a thing called Backstage, one of their orchestration and fleet management systems. It's really quite profoundly powerful. Now the whole internet and the entire world of open source can contribute to that thing as well. So you've got some boundaries or constraints that are kind of coming from external factors as well. And so that's the thing. It's like, where do you draw the boundaries of autonomy, and where do you create connections to keep people in sync? It's very interesting conversations. I think those kind of things are really worth digging into and thinking carefully about the design, because it's not just as simple as saying, well, we're going to have 25 squads doing this thing. Well, how are they going to work together? What are they going to, when do they talk to each other? What happens when I have a dependency on you? How do we solve that? And yeah, we'll meet once a month and talk about a dependency is a very poor solution in my experience.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks. Appreciate the answers. Appreciate the presentation as well. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Yeah, I said earlier,
I'll
punt the LinkedIn thing, but like, reach out. I'm happy to chat more.
Okay, great.
Cool.
Thank you. Cheers.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I think we'll call it there because we're a bit over time, and I'm conscious Cliff is in a hotel restaurant or a hotel lobby, I think. So he's probably quite keen to actually, continue his journey because it's an incomplete.
I need to go to my actual hotel now.
Yeah, just like the Spotify model was a snapshot in time and it was incomplete. Cliff's journey.
Yeah,
but I want to
continue shortly.
Thank you so much, and this is where I do my awkward round of applause. It's a lot better in person. I still haven't figured out a good way to do it virtually, but there you go. I can see lots of emojis with the hands, with the applauding hands. So Cliff, it was brilliant. I'm really glad to have you on, and thank you so much for taking time. And audience, thank you so much for joining as well. I hope you enjoyed the session.
Been a pleasure. Thanks so much. Cheers.
Take care. Take care. Bye-bye.